All right, so we are going through our series in Esther. Some of you know the story of Esther, some of you don't, and that's totally okay, right? And Esther is a story of a Jewish girl who ends up being the queen of Persia, right? Now, there's an actual kingdom. King Xerxes is the king at the time, and we've gone through all the history, right? We've got the people of Israel, and there's King David, woohoo, King Solomon, woohoo, and then there's a divided kingdom of Israel and Judah, and then other countries come and conquer. The Assyrians come and conquer the northern kingdom of Israel and scatter the people. And then the Babylonians come and conquer Assyria and the southern kingdom of Judah and scatter Jewish people around the place. And then the Persians come along and they conquer Babylon. And they kind of rule the ancient Near East, what we call. Basically everything from Pakistan to North Sudan and like almost to Greece. Right? Until such time as Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire comes and conquers throughout. But we're sitting here in the Persian Empire. Real time, real place, real people. And there are a load of Jewish people who are scattered among what would become the Persian Empire, right? And the Persian king Cyrus let a lot of people go back to their homeland, right? It was an act of keeping the peace in the empire. Hey, all you folk can go back to where you're from, and you can rebuild your temples, and you can rebuild your capital cities. And the Jewish people were no different. They got to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild its temple. Nevertheless, a number of Jewish people remained wherever they were in exile. And so we have these people, Mordecai and Esther, two Jewish people who live in the Persian Empire in one of the capital cities called Susa. And we encounter the story of Esther in the book of Esther, and the book of Esther relays this history in a very comedic fashion, right? In a very comedic fashion. And one of the reasons that the book of Esther relays this history in such a comedic fashion is because at the end of the day, the nations are nothing to God. God kind of scoffs at the nations just as much as we do. They're silly. They do silly things. And we see Xerxes, who's this almighty, omnipotent king of Persia, right? Who can't even make simple decisions without consulting a raft of bureaucrats. And we see the bureaucrats' really good idea for finding a new queen is not politically motivated. It's not looking to find one of the women in one of the noble families. They're like, let's have a beauty contest. That'll be a great way to find a new queen for you. And we see that actually Xerxes has a profound impotence, even though he's supposed to be this omnipotent, this very potent king of all of Persia. And so what we find also with Mordecai and Esther is very interesting, because though they're Jewish people, though they belong to God's people, in the whole book of Esther, God is never actually mentioned. It's the only book in the Bible where God is not mentioned. Prayer isn't mentioned. Jerusalem's not mentioned. The temple is not mentioned. God's promises aren't mentioned. And actually, Mordecai and Esther have names that aren't even related to the Jewish God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but are related to Babylonian gods. And we see that in that, what God is teaching us is, number one, God laughs at national powers. Right? Big empire, Russia, China, Britain, America, you name it. God's like, come on, guys. I mean, really? The height of any empire is pretty much a generation. And you're all silly. You know? You're talking about balloons, right? And balloons capture your imagination for about a week. And then it's like, squirrel, you know? And we're on to something else. So God kind of scoffs at that. Nevertheless, very serious stuff happens. And God's people and God's activity sometimes flies under the radar in order to accomplish his purposes, even in sort of the silliness of the world. So Mordecai and Esther, not only do they demonstrate that God and his people sometimes fly under the radar, but Mordecai kind of represents sort of in a way, not in a very literal way, but in an artistic way. Like, he sort of represents God, and Esther sort of represents God's people, right? In this story that we read, that is an actual history, I believe, but is relayed in a very particular way to communicate certain things. Now, in the silliness of the world, what we found out was Mordecai had a very real job in the government, and he found out about a plot to assassinate Xerxes, and he thwarted it. Good job. very serious and good stuff does happen even in these silly governments. And God has his people placed, often very strategically, we learned, in order to bless even these silly nations and their silly governments. And so Esther is queen, and we read about it last week or the week before, for such a time as this, because what happened is this guy Haman didn't like Mordecai because Mordecai wouldn't honor his glory. And so Haman came up with a plot for Jewish genocide. It's not the first time this happened for the Jewish people. It wouldn't be the last time. But that's where we find ourselves. That Haman, where you at, Mary? Come on. There we go. All right. That Haman had this plot to kill for genocide against the Jewish people. And Mordecai talks to Esther through an intermediary and says, you got to do something about this. You're in this position for such a time as this. All right. Now, chapter 5, verse 1. I'm going to kind of decide on the fly how much of this we're going to do, because we could go through chapters 5 and 6, because it's like basically a crazy 24-hour period. Like, it's like, did you ever watch the TV show 24? I didn't. I never got into it. But evidently the show actually takes like a 24-hour. This is like in 24 hours, man, crazy stuff. It's like rapid, all right? But we're just going to probably just stick with chapter 5 for this week. So on the third day, so this is Esther needs to go talk to Xerxes about what's going on, right? And she's already said, listen, you don't just rock up to the throne room, and Xerxes hasn't asked for me in like a month. So I don't want to die, because that could happen, but whatever happens, happens. I'm going to go try and talk to Xerxes. Chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. If it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king, together with Haman, where you at? Jeez, Mary. Goodness gracious, All right, bring Haman at once. I'm sorry. There you go. I'm sorry. Together with Haman, today, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. And this time we can all do it, all right? Bring Haman. Yeah, very good. All right. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now, what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given, or it will be granted. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow. All right, yeah. Come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. So here we've got Esther. We'll give a break to Haman, the king, because otherwise it's going to get messy. As though it hasn't already. So Esther needs to talk to King Xerxes about addressing this decree that all of the Jewish people in the whole of the Persian Empire should be slaughtered in genocide, right? And so she asks Xerxes to come along with Haman. She knows Haman's behind the plot, to dinner. And there's a little bit of question, already, Xerxes has been like, hey, whatever you want, even up to half my kingdom, which is a bit absurd, right? Why didn't she just ask him right then and there in the throne room? Why ask him for dinner? Oh, we're not exactly sure. Maybe she's a little bit timid. Maybe she's a little bit like, oh, I don't know. But she says, you guys come to dinner. And they come to dinner. It's a lovely dinner. And again, King Xerxes, what do you want, Esther? And she goes, come to dinner again. Again, we don't know. We might assume that Esther is understandably intimidated by the situation. She's understandably a little bit of two minds. I mean, have you ever gone to make a request of someone who was sort of significantly your organizational superior? you know? And what you had to ask was perfectly reasonable, but nevertheless, you're like, this could go pear-shaped. I'm not too sure. I mean, my request isn't unusual. I mean, it's kind of fair to say, by the way, I'm a Jew, and me and all my people are going to be slaughtered on this certain day. Could we not do that? That seems like a pretty reasonable request, right? Nevertheless, she can't quite bring herself to it. And that's fine. That's fine. It helps us as we carry along with the story. So let's carry along with the story. And now we're going to focus on Haman for just a little bit, and we'll blot his name out some more maybe later. So, Haman's been invited and has been to dinner with the king and queen of all of Persia. He's feeling pretty good about himself. He's feeling pretty good about life. Now, Haman went out that day. Wait, hold on. That day. Time out. That day. Isn't it night? Because it's after dinner? Let's remember, the Jewish people count days. We count days from sunup to sunup. Right? Or even from midnight to midnight, really. The Jewish people count days from sundown to sundown. So the new day begins at sunset. Right? So it's that day, even though it's late at night after, late-ish. It's after dinner, but it's that day. All right, so Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth and his many sons and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. So we get this sense of the fragility of Haman. Haman is vastly wealthy. Not only is he vastly wealthy, he's the most honored of the nobles in the Persian Empire, and he alone had dinner with just the king and queen. The dude is the cat's pajamas, and he's feeling it. Nevertheless, he cannot get over the slight to his ego that is Mordecai not thinking so much of him. Which is really interesting. Really interesting. Often it's the most egotistical that are the most fragile. The most concerned about showing how great they are, that actually, deep inside, know the poverty of their own personhood. All right, let's carry on. So he's bragged all to his wife and his friends, I'm great, but this guy Mordecai, I'm not great enough until he takes a knee and shows and tells me how awesome I am. His wife, verse 14 of chapter 5, his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 50 cubits. That's like 75 feet. How tall is our spire, by any chance? Am I have a guess? What's like, 75 feet is like what, 25 meters? I don't know this commie metric system. Okay? I'm joking, it's not commie. How tall do you think our anybody have a guess? Who knows this stuff? I don't know this stuff. How tall is 25 meters? It's tall. Yeah? It's, okay, probably about 85. So probably not as tall as our church spire, but kind of close-ish. It's kind of an absurdly high pole for what's about to happen. Have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. All right. Easy now. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. The suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. Okay, this is ridiculous. Haman is like, I'm awesome. But I cannot handle that Mordecai won't admit how awesome I am and acknowledge my awesomeness. And this is the great idea his wife and friends have. Make a pole, it's 25 meters tall, and impale Mordecai on it. Do it tomorrow so that you can enjoy yourself at dinner. It's ridiculous, right? We see some of the absurdity that is in Esther and in the portrayal of what's going on. Now, is it real? Did Haman want to have Mordecai impaled? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like that with people with fragile egos. They lash out. They're irrational. They don't make sound judgment. And those around them have to match their insanity, so that that person with the fragile ego doesn't lash out at them. So just over here, a little take home. Tend to your ego. And I don't mean tend to your ego as in like, make sure you think you're the junk. What I mean is, where is your security? Is it in the wealth that you have? Is it in the holidays you take? Is it in the clothes you wear? Is it in the position or your popularity in your community? Is it in the wealth that you don't have? I'm not like one of those rich punks. There's all kinds of ways that our fragile ego can build walls of defense around it. And when those walls are breached, someone with a fragile ego tends to lash out irrationally and destructively. And they will surround themselves with others who will operate in the same way. Because their fragile ego wants the status of that first person we're talking about. And so they'll build walls to protect themselves and that person they're with. Really destructive. Kids at school, listen, you know this really, really well. You know the bullies at school. You know people who lash out, people who will mock, people who will tease, people who are rude to other students, rude to their teachers, rude to adults, rude to you. And what they do is with that aggressiveness, right, and that rudeness, they're making everybody else feel defensive and a little bit afraid. And so sometimes what we're tempted to do is become friends with that kid. Because then maybe if we're friends with them, they won't attack us. And then all of a sudden we start defending that kid. But meanwhile, we know it's only a matter of time before that kid turns on us. And let me tell you just real quick, guys, it doesn't necessarily change as you get older. Isn't that right, adults? Right? So, Haman has a fragile ego. He doesn't know who he is, except for the fact that he's wealthy and powerful. Nevertheless, Mordecai won't acknowledge him, and it burns him up. And over here we have Esther. Esther, who's a bit timid. Maybe she doesn't need to be as timid as she is. But she is. And I don't know that Esther necessarily has a greater security than Haman does necessarily, but she doesn't have that fragile ego that supports the insecurity. She's just a bit aware of the magnitude of what's in front of her. And so maybe that's just a bit of humility rather than fragility of ego. And so in our lives, we have the opportunity to be a little bit like Haman or a little bit like Esther. Now, I try to avoid sermons that are like, be like so-and-so, okay? Because sometimes that's not necessarily the point of the scripture. And also we want to notice, while Esther comes in and she's very subtle with Xerxes, she's a bit timid, she's a bit or whatever, like, hey, come to dinner, yeah, come to dinner again. That's not always how the people of God act in the king's court. Sometimes it's Moses in Pharaoh's court saying, let my people go. You know, and here are plagues. So there isn't just one way in which the people of God interact with the world, but something for us to consider. And this is particularly poignant, again, not only has unity been in the, talked about a lot in the Church of England, but also the establishment of the Church of England has been in the news quite a bit this week. That the Church of England has this privileged place in the government. There are bishops who sit in the House of Lords. What is that all about? Is our status as the established church, is that about Haman, our fragile egos, and be like, hey, we're the Church of flippin' England. We got bishops in the Lords. We have a parish church in every community across this nation. I mean, yeah, they're closing and we can't keep them filled and we kind of suck at that, but we still have them. By golly. And everyone needs to recognize how great we are as the Church of England. And if you won't, then we're going to grrr. Or, as the Church of England, do we have an Esther disposition? The Church of England does have the privilege of being established. And that privilege is for such a time as this. And that is not to bend or give way to whatever it is the government wants us to do, but in order to be the presence of God's people and to be a blessing in the world, and even amid a silly and nonsensical government. The role of God's people in God's world, we've talked about in previous weeks, is to be a blessing. It's not about our ego. It's about our identity. Now, many of us in here, I don't know how many of you work in the government. I do. Isn't that weird? I'm like a civil officer. It's weird. But each of us has a position in a network of relationships. That could be a sports club. That could be your guitar group. It could be your neighborhood association. It could be a friends of group, a PTO group. It could be your workplace or whatever. Each and every one of us has a space in God's world in which we're not trying to protect our ego and feel about how cool we are, but within which we can do God's work and be a blessing. Sometimes that means we do things differently. But it's in that difference that we have something to offer. There's nothing to offer if we're just the same as the world around us. In that difference is something to offer, and that offering is a blessing. So I'd like each of us to consider, in my space of life, in the places I find myself, as someone who belongs to God's people, what do I have to offer that? However humbly, perhaps even a bit timidly. You don't need to be timid, but sometimes that's a reality. But there's something to offer. It's risky. Esther knew the risk. But it's a blessing. And it's what God has asked of us. So I'd like us to think about that and reflect about that as we're about to sing our next song of worship and prepare for our time of confession. Okay, because our time of confession might be, God, I haven't been willing to offer that in the world. It might be, God, I've never even thought about that, what you would have me offer, let alone known it and ignored it. Or it could be something else entirely altogether. But let's stand now and prepare our hearts, our minds for confession as Chris and Naomi come to lead us.